really horrifically blatant. For example, in the case of President Lula, we saw further evidence of some of this kind of trickery that's happening, including violations of Lula's right to privacy, freedom of arbitrary arrest, and the right to be presumed innocent until found guilty. So much so that Lula even had to go to the UN to appeal after the Brazilian Federal Supreme Court refused to consider alleged violations of the fundamental human rights by Judge Sergio Moro. This included leaking confidential data to the press, leaking of illegally obtained phone conversations between Lula and confidants, and recordings of those to the press, an abusive strategy of temporary and preemptive imprisonment in order to obtain plea bargaining deals implicating the former president. So that's what they did. Also, the official charge was coercive conduct against Lula on March 4th, 2016. That's what his defense lawyers accused him of, and they even had to go literally over the heads of the Brazilian Federal Supreme Court and go to the UN Human Rights Committee. That's really how bad it was. He filed this 39-page petition outlining alleged abuses of power. The petition claims that Lula is a victim of abuse of power by a judge with the complicity of prosecutors and the media. Yeah, the media actually had a pretty interesting role to play on this. The judicial proceedings, throughout these judicial proceedings, Brasil de Fato's article writes, the media coverage regarding the prosecution of the defendant has demonstrated a prejudicial alliance between the mainstream media and the Brazilian judiciary system. Last year, Judge Moro, alongside members of the prosecution, received strong condemnations after the court released illegally tapped phone calls between Lula and Dilma. Those came from, literally straight from Judge Moro and to the press. The legal process involved an impartial judge who has been several times accused of siding with the prosecution and failing to ensure the rights of defendants. So, unsurprisingly, his appeal was kind of struck down, and he was put back in prison while other appeals were considered, and his sentence was upped from 9 to 12 years. Again, all for, let's keep this in mind, literally accepting a triplex apartment in Brazil from a construction company in return for guarantees that they would get government contracts, but no one could prove in any way that he owned the apartment. The only confirmation they have was him visiting it once. And just because Sergio Moro wanted to put into place a broad application of the law to fight, quote, future corruption, now all of a sudden Lula not allowed to run for the Brazilian election that's coming up in 2018, as he would have won. And he was, even in prison, he would have been, until the moment the Supreme Court barred him from running, he would have almost certainly won, because he was well ahead in the polls, even while he was in prison. That's the crazy thing. So he gets struck out, and all of a sudden, the whole dynamic of the race changes. Jair Bolsonaro comes shooting up. Remember, as we talked about last episode, the guy who wants to allow mining companies back into the Amazon rainforest, logging companies as well, who said awful, horrible things about women, literally telling a female journalist, you're not good enough for me to rape, so I wouldn't rape you. Also saying things about Afro-Brazilians, the LGBTQ plus community, just so many awful things. And yeah, he won the election, obviously. And Lula today remains in prison. Many believe he is a political prisoner. So at this point, throughout Bolsonaro's reign, the questions have been building up against Sergio Moro, who is now no longer Judge Moro, but Minister Moro. He has been promoted to Super Justice Minister as of late, a position created by Jair Bolsonaro to entice, many people believe, Sergio Moro into his administration, giving him broad powers over the justice system to lend some legitimacy to his reign, because at the time he still was a very legitimate figure, very powerful, popular figure who represented the arm of justice in Brazil when so few people did. That status remained very largely intact until about a week ago.
Hey everyone, I'm Glenn Greenwald with The Intercept, and as you probably have heard, we published a series of articles this Sunday that have created what is, without exaggeration, a major political earthquake here in Brazil, and given the importance of these revelations as well as the complexity of them, I wanted to just spend a few minutes talking about the most critical aspects of our reporting, the implications of the reporting, and also what the future entails, given that the archive that we're using is one of the biggest archives in the history of journalism.
Glenn Greenwald of The Intercept has just, along with a team of reporters in his investigative journalism magazine, released something very major about Sergio Moro, Deltan Dallagnol, and the entire prosecutorial team that's been leading Operation Car Wash and how they've treated Lula, who has remained living in solitary confinement since around July of 2017 for his crimes. He's not been able to talk to the public. He's only been able to meet with his family, his lawyers, once a week. And he just recently, was able to talk to the public, talk to his fans, talk to his supporters. And now, as this happens, more and more is being found out about him, including these absolutely earth-shattering revelations published from a leaked archive by The Intercept. An important thing to remember was the stakes here at play in 2018 as Lula's appeal trial was heating up. What was at stake? What was going on? And the seismic events that occurred
was that Lula had announced, and everybody knew, that he was intending to run for president again in 2018, and all polls showed that he was the overwhelming frontrunner. He was leading every other candidate, including Bolsonaro, by 10, 15, 20, 25 points. And so when Lula was imprisoned, and then an appellate court very quickly affirmed that conviction with a strange speed in time to make him ineligible to run.
Keep in mind, they affirmed his conviction 3 times as fast as they do on average. This is just for Lula, some nice special treatment. It's also incredibly important to remember the immense power and public adoration that these people had.
And it turned into heroes the team of prosecutors, including led by a young prosecutor in his 30s named Deltan Dallagnol, who used his celebrity to write a best-selling book, and especially the judge who oversaw most of the convictions, who became an international celebrity, Sergio Moro. He was named as part of the Time 100 Most Influential Figures, and there was a huge 60 Minutes piece on him. They really became icons, heroes of the noble crusade to fight corruption. And here in Brazil, there was almost no journalistic questioning of them. They used the media. They would leak information all the time about whatever politicians whose reputation they wanted to destroy. They wielded immense power, and they put Lula in prison and removed him from the presidential race. And after a few years, people started questioning what their real motives were. Are they really apolitical, anti-corruption warriors who have no ideology other than fighting corruption and applying the law to everybody equally, which everyone agreed was a noble thing? Or were they really political operatives trying to do what Brazilians have been trying to do unsuccessfully since 2002, but were unable to do democratically, which is destroy the Workers' Party and bring the Brazilian right into power by exploiting and abusing the power of law?
This is what we talked about with the growing irregularities that we pointed out in the case of Lula's prosecution. As Glenn explains the consequential nature of this archive, it finally serves to validate a lot of suspicions long held about the prosecutorial team leading Operation Car Wash, who they really were, what their motivations really were, and how well hidden they were.
And what this archive unquestionably reveals, and even the most virulent and vocal defenders of Judge Moro and of the Lava Jato task force have admitted in the past 3 days since our reporting began, is that serious improprieties have been demonstrated on the part of both Judge Moro and the task force led by Dallagnol. We published 3 articles in particularly that demonstrated this. The first of which shows exactly what they have spent years denying. They've spent years denying that they have any political preferences, that they have any ideological views, that they care about who wins or loses elections. They've always vehemently insisted that. And yet the first story we published shows exactly the opposite. that internally in their private chats that we've exclusively obtained, they were talking openly about how their goal was to prevent the Workers' Party from winning the 2018 election.
The big moment for them was a Supreme Court case that really granted a petition from the country's largest newspaper, Folha de Sao Paulo, to interview Lula, which had never been done before since he was in prison. And immediately upon learning of that decision on the September 28th, 2018, a team of prosecutors who handled the corruption case, who spent years vehemently denying that they were driven by political motives of any kind, began discussing in a private Telegram group chat how to block, subvert, or undermine the Supreme Court decision. They were scared. They were really worried about, and they spent really the whole day debating strategies to prevent or dilute the political impact of Lula's interview. They were complete political creatures. As if the scandal could not get any worse for them, they apparently, according to these messages, which have been proven to be true and no one really has come out denying them substantially yet, the car wash prosecutors explicitly said that their motive was stopping Lula's interview to prevent PT, the Workers' Party, from winning. One of the prosecutors, Laura Tesler, explained upon learning of the decision, "What a joke," and then explained the urgency of preventing or undermining the decision. She said, "A press conference before the second round of voting could help elect Haddad," referring to PT's candidate, Fernando Haddad, who is running in place of Lula in the election against Bolsonaro. The chief of the prosecutor task force, Deltan Dallagnol, conducted a separate conversation with a longtime confidant, also a prosecutor, and they agreed that they would pray together for the events of that day but they prayed that the events of that day would not usher PT's return to power. So the messages specifically read, this is Carol in this group chat. She says, "Delton, my friend, all of my solidarity in the world with you this episode. We're on a runaway train, and I don't know what's waiting for us. The only certainty is we're in this together. I remain very worried about the possible return of PT, but I have prayed frequently for God to enlighten our population and for a miracle to save us." Delton's response, "I'm with you, Carol. Pray indeed. We need this as a country." These admissions of the prosecutor's true concerns that a Lula interview could elect Haddad and usher in a return of PT to power were hardly isolated confessions. To the contrary, the entire discussion, held over many hours, reads far less like a meeting of neutral prosecutors, more than a war room session of anti-PT political operatives and strategists, focused on the goal of determining the most effective way to prevent or minimize the political impact of Lula's interview. This shattered the scales off the eyes of Brazilians and has been resonating deeply throughout Brazilian politics. Sergio Moro has said he's done nothing wrong, but the Supreme Court has already agreed to review the case. And by the way, this is only part one. In part two of these messages, leaked chats between Brazilian judge Sergio Moro and the prosecutor reveal doubts about the evidence they had in their case against Lula. Telegram messages between Sergio Moro and Deltan Dallagnol reveal that Moro repeatedly stepped far outside the permissible bounds of his position as a judge while working on the car wash cases. Over the course of more than 2 years, Moro suggested to the prosecutor that his team changed the sequence of who they would investigate, insisted on less downtime between raids, gave strategic advice and informal tips, provided the prosecutors with advanced knowledge of his decisions, offered constructive criticism of prosecutorial findings, and even scolded Dallagnol as if the prosecutor worked for the judge. Such conduct is incredibly unethical for the judge, who is responsible for maintaining neutrality to guarantee a fair trial, and violates the judiciary's code of ethics for Brazil. Obviously, this calls into question not just Lula's imprisonment and trial, but almost every single case, and boy, there's a lot of cases, that Sergio Moro ever presided over. If he was thinking like this, if he was thinking with a mind towards getting as much people in jail as possible and frequently collaborating with the prosecution on this, I mean, the only logical thing, right, would be to go over, re-examine these cases, and find out how much he was involved with the prosecutors. This could call into question that everything car wash has to offer and completely destroy the credibility of one of Brazil's national heroes for the past 5 years. Will it? It's too early to tell, but the implications